Welcome to the podcast where we celebrate innovation for a happy planet. I am your host, Abigail Carroll. With all of the good work that oysters can do for the planet, filtering water, preventing erosion, lowering acidification, and more, today's entrepreneur wanted to figure out if a living oyster in the water could be more valuable in terms of dollars or euros than an oyster on your plate. And the answer appears to be a resounding yes. Our guest is George Birch, and his business is called Oyster Heaven, and we're going to find out how he's done this oyster alchemy. Let's hear it from George. Welcome to the podcast, George.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's delightful to have you here. We have something in common that we're both growing oysters, yet you have found a business plan that puts mine to shame. So what is the problem you're trying to solve, and how is Oyster Heaven going to solve it?
So for me, the grand problem of which oysters are a segment is addressing the massive gaps in our ecosystem that humanity has created over the last few hundred years. I think there's a lot of attention going towards our land, and really great things are happening, and far less attention is going towards our oceans. I really wanted to find a business model that could address the sort of missing ecosystems, the missing habitats in the water, whether it's seagrass, whether it's kelp, whether it's oysters or coral, all of these different things, and find a way that we could move away from the dependence on government or philanthropic finance. Because for me, there's just not enough money there to address the size, the magnitude of the problem that we've got. This number might be familiar to some of the people listening, but I think globally we're missing about 85% of our oyster reefs. And in exploited areas like the North Sea, it's more like 99%. They're functionally extinct there. So this is the problem that I'm trying to fix, trying to find a scalable and financially independent solution to restoring missing oyster reefs around the world.
And why are oyster reefs so important?
Yeah, so when I came into this as well, I wasn't necessarily an oyster lover by any means. I came from a marine ecology background, and I think keystone species are incredibly interesting, and particularly these ecosystem engineers, so creatures that change the environment around them in some sort of way. And this might be beavers building dams, this might be oysters building their reefs. So in the marine ecosystems, there are not very many that build big 3D complex structures, and corals are probably the most familiar. Oysters less so, because we've eaten most of them. So you don't see these big complex undulating 3D reefs in the same way, but they do host the most incredible array of biodiversity and different types of life around them. And not only that, but they do an incredible job of filtering our water. So bivalves, just like mussels and clams, they're filter feeders. They settle out all sorts of algae and sediment in the water, making it much clearer. And as I said already, provide homes for all sorts of nice biodiversity, fish, lobsters, crabs. And they're also really good at helping prevent coastal erosion and tidal surges. So creating these underwater breakwaters so that big waves as they hit the shore aren't doing the same kinds of damage.
So your mechanism, you want to get paid basically to grow oyster reefs. You want to get paid to keep an oyster in the water rather than have it harvested.
Yes.
And so what is the mechanism that you're going for? What's the business plan?
So I remember early on, someone said to me, George, did you know that one oyster can filter 200 liters of water a day? And apparently BAE Systems says it's the best filtration system known to humanity. Now, I've tried to look that quote up. I can't find it attributed to BAE Systems, but that's definitely what they told me. I can't remember who said it. But I think even though it's a bit tenuous, the 200 liters is certainly true. And I said, why the hell isn't anyone trying to sell oysters as filter systems? Because if it's the best filtration system known to humanity, it's probably worth a bit more than the protein that they're made of. So then I started looking at other problems like pollution in our waterways, and realized that people were getting pretty excited and upset about the state of our deltas, our river estuaries. I said, okay, brilliant. Let's put oysters in there. They'll clean the water, and we can sell cleaning contracts to local government or organizations who are in excess of their pollution allowances. That's where it started.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of nuance that comes onto that, because what you don't want to be doing is being accused of greenwashing. So you've got to do it in the right circumstances, in the right magnitude. You've got to be doing it alongside a bunch of different other interventions as well. It's got to be the meaningful size. But the essence is there. The essence is reimagining an oyster not as a lump of meat, but imagining it like as a smartphone, which obviously you don't value a smartphone by the value of its scrap metal. You value it by all the amazing functions that it does. And so I'm trying to get people to understand that this little shell and bit of meat inside is actually this incredibly complex, amazing machine which has been developed over millions and billions of years.
So when you talk about a cleaning contract, that's not exactly the direction you took. Did you try that?
So it depends where you are. And taking a step back, and as we've just discussed before our conversation, oysters are an unambiguous part of a healthy marine ecosystem around the world. Now, however, the regulation emerges, we've got this very clear signposted trajectory towards the needs to have more environmental sustainability and treating or, putting less pressure on our environment. How exactly those regulations emerge, and they need to emerge in the next 10 or 15 years, I'm pretty ambivalent. Whether these are nitrogen credits, whether they are resilience credits, whether you are selling some sort of bundled charismatic ecosystem service package or something like this, it doesn't really matter. We just are looking for these funding mechanisms that can help us generate money independent of philanthropy or governments. So it really depends what country you're in.
Yeah.
And in a lot of places at the moment, oysters are not part of any sort of regulation.
Right. And you're in the UK, by the way.
We work in the UK and the Netherlands. Also, we've got projects sort of launching in Belgium and Ireland, and we're working in Denmark and also in the Chesapeake Bay. So in the US, and I think in the Chesapeake Bay, where there's the most interesting example, which we take a lot of inspiration from, is the TMDL, Total Manageable Daily Limit, which is there is a certain amount of nitrogen which is allowed into the Chesapeake Bay, and there, states of Maryland and Virginia are just putting into law the ability to sell nitrogen credits from restored oyster reefs to point source emitters. Now, this is not a liquid or mature market. I think a few $1,000s of trades have ever happened, but it is there, and there is an intention there. And then alongside other efforts like the US Army Corps trying to do nature inclusive coastal protection, you can then layer on things like selling nitrogen credits at the end of it as the sort of regulation matures. In the UK as well, we have a regulation called nutrient neutrality, which means that in 30% of England's landmass now, if you want to build a home, it has to be nutrient neutral, which means that they know on average one home will produce a kilo of nitrogen sewage each year, and you have to account for that somehow in the local system, in the local watershed. Now, again, oysters at the moment can't touch that, but we have got the conditions from the relevant authority, Natural England, that says, okay, if you can demonstrate X, Y, and Z, you can participate on these platforms. And I mean, this is probably not so exciting an element of this. And then when there isn't regulation, you can point to this regulation emerging in the UK or the US and say, Dutch government's talking about this. It's probably coming. You've got a big dairy footprint. If you want to maintain your social license to operate and you want to be able to maintain your supply chain, maybe it's worth investing in some technologies to secure a pipeline of credits or benefit or something like that in the future. Oysters take 4 or 5 years to grow. We say regulation might appear at some point in the next 4 or 5 years. So probably start now planning.
All right. So tell me a little bit about you. How did this idea come about, and what's your background, and how did you think beyond just harvesting oysters and sticking them in a bag for, 50 cents, maybe $1 a pop, and getting them to the local restaurant. First of all, do you eat oysters?
Yeah, I eat oysters. Unfortunately, no, not unfortunately. No, I was about to say so far, there's oysters are quite fragile, and in a lot of our experiments, not all the oysters make it, unfortunately. So I think you've got to be okay with some oyster deaths. And yeah, I eat a few oysters. I think very often if you're going to go meet oyster farmers, they're going to offer you some oysters, and I think you should be, nice to participate in. Gracious, exactly. So I got into this. I studied ecology at university and ended up looking at seaweed. And I chose seaweed because a little bit of laziness, which was all of my colleagues who were like trying to study otters. I was just thinking, there's no way they're going to see an otter. They're going to be spending a whole summer looking for otters around rivers, and they're going to be really disappointed. And they ended up having to look through otter shit because they couldn't find otters. And I said, seaweed doesn't run away. That's a lot of it. It's also on the beach. So I went and spent a couple of months on the beaches in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, which is absolutely beautiful, looking at seaweed. So sort of combined various quite nice activities with my research project. And then I went to work for the Blue Marine Foundation for a really short amount of time because I got quite interested in trying to find more sustainable ways of working with our ocean and regenerating it. And the starting gun was I went to go work on this rewilding project. In the UK, it's very trendy at the moment. You sort of take some low quality agricultural land out of production, you put some fences around it, and then just let nature take over. And there's some sort of clever ways that you can basically get payments from the government for the ecosystem services that you're generating. But it's a little bit of a fudge at the moment. The government recognizes this as a good idea. Now they're making more formal ways to actually recognize the value that these rewilded systems are doing. And I thought, okay, great. There's this model that is ready to start trying to value nature and ready to pay for it. How can we scale this massively? So take it beyond just individual farms. How can you standardize it, make it replicable, and then sell the ecosystem services? So for me, I thought the problem was on land, you can't just create monocultures of things because nature on land is not monocultures. But in the oceans, native oysters were these colossal monocultures, this sort of living soil that everything else grew from. So you've got this currency, which is oysters, and they say that 20 to 30% of the North Sea used to be oyster reefs. Now, not all of them were alive, only a percentage of them were alive, but this big 3D structure was all there, and it was all oysters.
Yeah.
So actually, as a unit, if you could create something where you could have an intervention and system that would put lots of oysters in the water wherever you went in the world, high scale, at a low cost, involving local communities, you've got something there.
So a farmer, a dairy farmer, might not be making a lot of money. It's a tough situation because these land farmers are often struggling, and often they have crappy years until they have a great year, and it's boom or bust. And how are they perceiving this? Is this just seen as another tax that's sort of stymieing their business?
So we don't target the actual farmers. We target the multinationals that source from the farmers. It is really these organizations, they have a growing responsibility to the widest notion of what their supply chain and their footprint is like. So I think it's very difficult to pinpoint one farm and point fingers, but you can say, okay, you're sourcing from all around the world, all around the North Sea. If you want to continue sourcing from your farmers or the North Sea, you need to also be investing in them. So in the same way as you might invest in a factory which is quite old and operationally not doing so well anymore, you'll invest in the North Sea if you want it to continue producing fish that you can put into your products.
Very smart. So these big multinationals would basically help you build these oyster farms. Is this a one-time investment, presuming that oyster reefs will continue to grow? Or would they is there a rolling fee structure where they pay in every year to keep and maintain these reefs?
So the model that we like is when we put a reef into the water, we talk about a partnership with a group of local organizations, and that particularly means local fishing communities, us as Oyster Heaven, local academia, local government. And then these partners hopefully receive money from, we get a group of investors. In an ideal world, that would be some sort of local pension fund. And together, Oyster Heaven brings our technology, our consulting, our expertise. We work with the fishing communities to deploy these reefs in coastal areas that they look after. We work with the local academia that then goes and says, okay, we've got this much biodiversity uplift in 4 years' time. We've got this much nitrogen management or phosphate management capability. And then as a group, we can then sell the benefits that we generate. And then we walk away with an equitable amount of the benefit that we've put into the project. So what your effort that goes in comes to a reward that goes out. And then we always budget at least a 10-year program. And for me, this still doesn't sound very long, but if you look at other kinds of restoration efforts, it's often 2 or 3 years before they walk away. But actually, if you're thinking about the groups that they impact, so these fishing communities, they're here for generations. So we need to have a proper handover plan, and we need to have a proper way that this can continue generating some sort of benefit over perpetuity. So we have an upfront cost for putting them into the water. And then after 4 years, we do the first measurement, 6, 8, and then 10. And we do new sets of measurement, and then we do a new sale in that period as well. Theoretically, throughout the 10-year period, you'll have revenue coming in periodically, which will be then divided amongst the project participants as well. And at the end of that 10-year period, it will depend how long you can keep that process going on. This is the point at which Oyster Heaven says, we want to walk away, but we want to make sure that there is a future for this project and that it's not going to be taken out of the water. And whether that is continued sales of ecosystem services, or we've upskilled or retrained some of the fishers so that they're now doing monitoring jobs so that they can continue to be doing that type of payment, or we've brought in new ecotourism. I think we're really flexible how that looks. And then the very long-term vision is in 20 years' time, the overflow from this new marine oasis that we've created can mean that there is some sort of sustainable wild fishery around it, whether that's oysters or crab or whatever else it is. So I think we really care about the long-term benefit.
Yeah, very super interesting. So this carbon markets, or all of these credit markets, if you will, are new. And I think there's been some pushback about enabling.
Yeah.
And so how do you view that?
The carbon markets have got one really positive element about them and a number of really negative elements. And I think the one positive element is that we've learned a lot from their problems.
With the carbon, because it's unmeasurable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've now got an example of all the things that can go wrong with it. And we've learned a lot. And I think that the negative things about the carbon market is, firstly, although it is just another chemical of concern, like, for example, we need to deal with excess nitrogen in our water or excess phosphate, and you say, okay, the problem with carbon is it's a diffuse issue. Yeah. So carbon goes into our atmosphere, and it doesn't matter whether you take it out in Indonesia or in Germany, you can kind of do these weird long distance trades. And this leads to really severe undercutting. So your blue carbon project is completely cost uncompetitive with your Indonesian rainforest carbon project. The second thing is, because they're so far away from each other, the sourcing is really opaque. So you end up with lots of gaming and double counting and things like that, which undermines the integrity of these projects a lot.
Yeah.
The third thing is, because we've got to take carbon from our atmosphere and then put it underground, actually ensuring that there is persistence in the storage is incredibly challenging. So that the whole system is really fraught with problems, even though people are giving a really good shot at it.
Yeah.
The two really big advantages, on the other hand, that nitrogen and biodiversity markets have, I'll first talk about nitrogen. One is nitrogen, the fossil storage is our atmosphere. Through the Haber-Bosch process, We take it out of our atmosphere, put it into our fertilizer and into our soils, and it's generated all sorts of benefits. We're feeding billions more people than we could have otherwise done so. However, 50% of it runs immediately off our fields into the water, causes algal blooms and eutrophication, marine dead zones like in the Gulf of Mexico that happens every year. Now, oysters do two things. They have two actions on nitrogen. One is they bioextract the nitrogen from the water. They eat the algae that blooms. That causes them to grow. So there's nitrogen which is stored in their shells, which eventually gets buried. There is a mechanism there which is slightly safer in terms of the persistence of that credit. But the more important one is that there is a symbiotic association of bacteria and archaea that live within an oyster reef, and particularly in the anaerobic sediment around it. And there is a cascade of chemical reactions which transforms ammonia, bioactive nitrogen into N2 gas, which is basically insoluble in water and bubbles back up to the surface into our atmosphere, which is the fossil storage. And you can measure those bubbles. You can measure the bubbles and you say, we know exactly how many kilos are going back to the atmosphere. And this is a storage that does not leak. And one, you can be really sure of the persistence.
Yeah.
Two is you cannot trade nitrogen between Southeast Asia and somewhere in Europe. It has to be local. It has to be in a watershed because a nitrogen problem is incredibly acute. It's incredibly local. So that's a really long-winded way of saying that nitrogen markets automatically has quite a lot more high integrity. And the second thing with biodiversity, which again has got more high integrity, this is really easily explainable. It's there. You can go and have a look at it, right? It's a visible thing. At the moment, we're only working with industries which we believe are vital to the transition to a sustainable economy. So at the moment, we're only working with a few industries where, for example, providing food, providing water, or providing homes, because we see these as absolutely vital. Now, that's not to say we won't entertain other industries. We're always up for having a conversation and understanding like what that plays. But at the moment, the organizations which we're approaching and interested in working with are in these industries. And then the final thing is that we only work on projects which we know have got a very high chance of turning into a recruiting oyster population. Putting 1,000 oysters into the water somewhere, the likelihood is they're just going to die off. Oysters survive in very large numbers. So we say at a minimum, we work on projects which are 3.75 million oysters. That is quite expensive. You can't just, it is not something that you can just throw away some cash in and then put it onto your CSR report. It's got to be a meaningful investment to work with us.
You've done a major deal, the major multinational, and you've clearly found a model that is not only sustainable, but prosperous. This isn't just ideas. We get a lot of people on here just with the big ideas, but this is actually happening now. How does that feel?
This organization, so we're not at a point with them where they are going through the action of buying biodiversity credits or nitrogen credits yet. This is our first big project, or is one of the few projects that we're starting right now. But they see this as, okay, we get your story. We want to develop this technology with you. We want to see how this looks across our business. We're going to back you to take it to that position. So this is a big R&D effort with them that they're doing to support this story that we've got. And if we are successful, then this project will expand to something really quite dramatic. And this will be the sort of golden case study for being able to go and do it with other organizations in other countries. And if this all works out well, that's quite a precedent.
Right. Because you're not talking about like a few $100,000. We're talking about potentially tens of millions of dollars here.
Yeah, yes.
I mean, so in a way, it's not out of the question that you could be a unicorn oyster farmer.
I
mean, you could, if you step back and you get 10 or 15 clients, you could be looking at a massive, massive opportunity here.
I think somehow...
You're blushing, George.
It feels disingenuous. And I feel like people sometimes don't believe me, but For me, this means more oysters in the water. I've got very few aspirations personally for like some sort of lifestyle goals or something. But if we've unlocked a model to exponentially restore oyster reefs around the world, I can die a happy person, right? This is the dream for me. I would say don't count my unicornness in terms of dollars, but count it in terms of oysters, right? If I can do 1 billion oysters, like that is the goal for me. That'd be incredible.
No, that would certainly help the planet. Well, congratulations. I mean, it's good work, and you'll have a lot of oyster farmers interested. Would you ever consider franchising?
I think franchising is the only way forward. I don't want an organization which is hundreds of people. I really enjoy the culture that we've got at the moment. I also think that we don't, as an organization, have a mandate to be going around and like taking over marine sites. My model is I want to make sure that these coastal communities have got the concept, the tools, the manual to run these projects themselves.
Yeah.
And we can help as much as they're needed. I really like the idea of oyster farmers participating because 2 reasons. One, they know oysters already. Obviously, like it's a really easy switch over. They're involved with water. They understand it far better than we do. We understand like the transactions of working in brick factories to make our oysteries, but actually, water expertise is with these guys. But secondly, the most challenging element, the thing with the biggest bottleneck, is finding areas of marine spatial planning and then adapting it, like getting permission to be working with the substrate and oysters. And these oyster farmers have already got licenses to be working with oysters. So that's the biggest hurdle out the way. And a lot of them have got already a permit. So actually, I think you can switch from oyster farming to oyster rewilding like really, really quickly. And for the people that are really struggling doing this, and there are places, for example, in France where just the price of oysters is just like not making sense for people. There is a new route to revenue and profitability in the same way as farmers in the UK are switching to rewilding when the farm quality is not high enough to be competing with the really, really low prices on the market for their wheat.
Wow. Well, I know a lot of oyster farmers that will be very delighted to hear about this. So
okay, brilliant.
We'll be broadcasting to the right people. So tell me this. So are you fundraising?
Yeah. So at the moment, we're also raising money to build the next set of projects. And we need to hit this sort of, $50 million, €50 million ticket size to then get these institutional investors interested in investing in these projects.
Yeah.
But what we need now is, so we've got this first project, which is being funded by this client, and we need maybe 3 or 4 more to have a de-risked concept. And then if we've got 4 or 5 projects in the water around Europe and maybe a couple in the Chesapeake Bay, we can speak to these institutional investors and say, look, the technology works, the business model works, we want to do the next 40 of them. We need a financing capacity to do this. So in the same way as, you build a wind farm, your investors, you build your wind farm and then you sell energy to pay back the yield for your investors. So what we're looking for at the moment is about $7.5 million. And these are to build the next 4 projects in Northern Europe and 1 in the US. And we haven't got a very strong idea about what exactly the financial form that's going to be. But I think we prefer this like JV idea. We really like this model I was talking about a bit earlier, where we get partnership with us, the local communities, the investors, and really bringing something together which has a lot of like local input.
Okay. Well, we will definitely spread the word. A climate entrepreneur. I love now that you can start with climate. Like climate is now the problem to solve. Yeah. I mean, that's a really fundamental shift in thinking and proof that we've already put a price on nature. It's a huge step forward. So are you optimistic that we're going to stay ahead of all these climate pressures?
We are faced with a really serious set of challenges. I'm going to do my best, right? And I think there are some really interesting ways that we could get a handle on this. What gives me some sort of comfort is that actually nature regeneration can solve a lot of these all at once.
Yeah.
Whether it's ocean acidification or biodiversity loss or climate change, actually, if we just start putting back nature, there's these very broad, powerful tools. So I think if this model gets accepted rapidly and people start putting their mind to it, I think we've got a good shot. There's some really interesting potential for using technology that we can't even comprehend yet. And I'm not even going to pretend that I comprehend it. So that gives me a little bit of hope as well, because I'm not sure that humanity on its own has got sort of creativity to solve the problem in the time that we've got left.
Yeah. I keep harkening back to the pandemic and how there are dolphins in Venice. Like when we stepped back, nature rebounded and took over. I mean, there are animals running around Paris. Do we have to step back, or can we sort of boost nature enough to solve the problem in your eyes?
I think how fast nature comes back is the most heartening thing for me. And there's so much evidence that this whole like taking your hands off the steering wheel approach really, really works. And there are some videos from the net rewilding project which like make me cry every time, because you just see how many insects are in the air and how many, scientists getting excited about just like this one special butterfly that they haven't seen in 100 years, and that gets me a bit emotional. So nature's going to be fine. Okay, whether humanity drives itself to extinction in 20 million years time, we're going to speciate, all the creatures are going to speciate again, we're going to have all the different niches filled. Nature's going to be fine. It's just our society which is in a lot of trouble. So I think I'm less concerned for nature. Nature, I think, is pretty ambivalent. This, as a sort of general esoteric concept, nature doesn't really care. It's just getting on with it. The problem is what's going to happen to society, and that's going to be really hard work. So it gives me a lot of hope. And so going back to your question, can we just step back, or do we need to give it a push? I think a bit of both. So I think, for example, if you want to stop desertification, you can't just expect trees to start growing in a desert. You do need active intervention, because you've hit this tipping point where there is only sand left. But once you do put your tree plantation, there are lots of projects where you can see it's really working. You're creating these microclimates, and then you can stop. And the same thing with oysters. We don't need to repopulate the whole 20% of the North Sea. We can do 1% of that. And that 1% will then start recruiting around it and spreading out well. So it's just, you've got to put just enough effort in. You've got to roll that boulder up the hill just so that it goes beyond the tipping point, and then it starts going back down the other side.
So you are a seasoned entrepreneur. You're an entrepreneur who's thinking out of the box, and apparently on the cusp of success. It looks like it's going your way. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs today?
It seems like a really obvious thing to say, and I was given the same piece of advice, and I'm sure everyone has going to have heard the same piece of advice, but it is so important. Focus on a problem. And there are too many really clever people tinkering away at really clever things, and they'll develop something that we just don't quite need.
Yeah.
And if you don't quite need it, it's not going to turn into a business. That doesn't mean what you've made is not good and interesting and worthy of recognition, but there's a difference between hobbyism and then trying to make a business that works in the really merciless world of capitalism. And I think the perfect example of this is, so before I went to do an MBA in Rotterdam, I had a whole bunch of ideas about businesses that I wanted to start. The MBA was brilliant, and it showed me why all of my ideas that I had before this were bad ideas. And the best example of this was I really liked working with plants, and I thought, okay, apparently the air quality has a really important influence on your cognitive performance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this cool modular system for growing plants in offices, and then they're going to improve the air quality. And I will, instead of selling plants, I'll sell a cognitive improvement package to CEOs. I'll say, right, how much would you pay for a 5% improvement in your employees' cognitive performance? And I think that seemed like a great idea at the time. And then, but the question is, and the question that you will get is, are plants the best way to improve air quality? The answer is no. Opening the window is. Okay? And that little problem is, I think, the fundamental reason why tons and tons of ideas just don't work. I wanted to work with plants because I like plants. And then I ignore the fact that there are better ways to deal with this problem. So if you've got a good idea and it's a real good idea that's solving a real problem, things will be really frictionless because people get it. And I think if it's not working, really look hard at your idea.
Time to pivot. I think that's great advice. I mean, I really do think that's great advice.
I don't think it's very original, though. I think everyone says this. It's just hard to recognize, I think, when you've got too in love with your own innovation. And I think it's really easy to do. Right.
Well, I think that's great advice. And maybe you said it in a different way, too. I think you could also maybe pivot around to make sure that you're solving a problem. Maybe you have the right product, but you're not solving the right problem.
Yeah. So one of the elements of the culture that I try to have in our organization is I say that we're a group of people that are excited to be wrong.
Yeah.
Every opportunity we can find that will prove one of our theses wrong and we can do something in a better way, we should be excited about that and not disheartened by that.
Right.
And it gets harder and harder the deeper you are into it. But staying excited to not know all the answers, I think, is really, really important. You know, we haven't spoken at all about our technology, but we've got this clay artificial reef that, for a bunch of reasons, we think is really great. It's really scalable. It's a natural material. We can produce 30 hectares of it per day, 240,000 of them from one factory. But we say that if there's a better way of doing this, if another organization has got a better substrate, a better artificial reef, then we'll use that. Because our mission is not, let's try and sell as much of our artificial reefs as possible. It's let's put as many oysters in the water as possible. If there's a better route to doing that, then we should be taking that route.
I think doubt is actually a subject that I haven't really explored probably enough on this podcast, because we've been very focused on kind of what are you doing? How are you doing it? How is this going to impact the climate? And I think exploring those moments of doubt is actually really important and really helpful to people, because it is a very lonely enterprise being a founder.
Yeah, I agree. No, I think it's so one of the big things that I was told at the very start of all of this, I have my godfather who doesn't really do anything to do with this. He's been sort of working in organic food his whole life, but doing entrepreneurial stuff with organic food. And he sort of said this one thing, which I think has been really helpful, which is never need a law to change for your business to be successful. You can't wait for the sort of government to get it together. And then you can sort of get on with it, because you're going to be potentially waiting for a really long time, and it's really difficult to predict what anyone's going to do. And I think this has been generally is working for me, and it's working for some people, but that's this thing that people keep on talking about, like regulatory risk. And I mean, I'm getting into a deep thing here, but I think this need that we've got to get to some sort of environmental and social sustainability might be the most well signposted theme ever. And the alternative is total collapse. And so for me, it's so obvious, but I don't think people have really sort of truly grasped the sort of existential nature of what this is about sometimes. And I speak to some people who just go oh yeah, but but biodiversity credits are not really priced properly yet or something. Anyway.
So what is it that you're waiting on? What law that and that's because you've got the nitrogen credit going your way.
I'm not really waiting on any particular law. Whether something happens in 5 years or 10 years, however the regulatory standards emerge, oysters will be rewarded because they are integral part of ecosystems around the world.
Right. They're
a keystone species. So it's like we're never going to sort of go 20 years into the future and go like, oh, oysters were a bad idea. If you're restoring something, generally they're not going to be unpredictable negative consequences to it. So I think should be a big sort of like de-risking concept. And I think generally that means, whether you're doing things from a sort of like US type law perspective or a European high regulation perspective, there will be a nice place for oysters to sit. And I think if capitalism sort of does work, then it ultimately has to pay for these things which are generating value. So I think from a sort of generalistic perspective, if you are doing something which is needed by society will eventually pay you for it. No.
Right. So you believe in the capitalist system?
I don't necessarily believe in the capitalist system. I think it gets a lot of things really wrong, but it's the system that we've got. It needs to work better for nature, or at least it needs to work for nature as it does for different elements of our society.
Well, we just have to put a price on nature. And that was the subject of my podcast in the last season with Harry Wright, the founder of Bright Tide, was, how do we put a price on nature? Nature has a value. And I think we're starting to see that with these markets.
Yeah, no, I think so as well. And so at the moment, you'll sell your oyster wholesale. To be honest, you'll know this better than me. I don't know what you sell an oyster wholesale for. I know you can probably buy a ton of oysters in Ireland for about 7,000 euros. I don't know, they're about 100 grams each. Anyway, it's not much, 50 cents each or something like that. And that's if you take the oyster out of the water. But if you can make the value of that oyster be €1, when you leave it in the water, then suddenly the financial incentive is greater to leave it in the water. So people will do that. Right. Again, this comes back to like capitalism, rational economics or something like that. You make more money by doing one action instead of another. We haven't got a price on leaving it in the water yet. And I think this is what we're working towards.
George, it's been amazing to have you on the podcast. Really just so inspiring. I wish I'd thought of it first, but I'm glad you are on it. And it's a wonderful...
franchise. Come on, if you want to get back into it.
I know. I don't. No, I don't. I can help you spread the word though. Anyhow, right. It was just so fun. What a great chat. And I'm so excited for you and really wish you the best.
Thank you very much. It was really lovely to have a chat with you, and good luck with everything.
Okay. Well, I'm a little bit jealous of George's business plan. I'm so grateful that we had him on the podcast today. These credit markets are taking shape fast, especially in Europe, where they do seem to be ahead of the rest of the world. Building more oyster reefs will provide a great benefit to the ocean's health, and it proves the old adage wrong that a bird in the hand is worth more than the tree. In this case, an oyster in the reef is more than two on someone's plate. I hope oyster farmers who are interested in this model will reach out to George. His website is www.oysterheaven.org, and we'll also put all his information in our show notes. Thank you again for listening. Please follow Happy Planet wherever you tune in and leave us a rating and review. It really does help new listeners discover the show. Happy Planet was reported and hosted by me, Abigail Carroll. I am also the executive producer. The talented Josie Holtzman is our producer and editor, and composer George Brandel Egloff created our theme music. Learn more about my work and get in touch by visiting happyplanetpodcast.com.